What are peak Venti's biggest pros and cons? That's what I'm here to tell you today. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So as we all know, Venti is getting buffs this patch, which means that all of a sudden, he has went from being a rather niche pull to an actually good character. So, now is a better time than ever to evaluate what his pros and cons are again. One of his big pros that he's going to be gaining upon getting his Hexenzirkel buffs is that he's going to have the capability to become the best Anemo DPS. You heard that right. In 2025, Venti is going to be an actual serious meta DPS. He's going to be gaining Anemo infusion on his normal attacks after he uses his elemental burst, and whenever he uses his normal attacks, he's going to extend the duration of his burst. So, because of this, he is not only becoming a really good Anemo DPS, but he's also going to be a very good AOE DPS, and all around, he's just becoming a competitive damage dealer on the whole, which is absolutely ridiculous to think about. If you told me that this timeline was coming, I would have never believed you, but here we are. Venti is in fact a very good DPS. So, in terms of the Anemo DPSs, he's going to be the best of them. Now the real question to ask is where does he sit on the overall DPS spectrum, and in that case, I would say that he is about as good as Arlecchino, with Arlecchino being better in single target, and Venti being better in AoE. That would be the best comparison to make. And Arlecchino on her best assault team, while she is indeed outclassed by Moeka, is still a very strong DPS. So Venti is the best Anemo DPS, while generally being quite a good DPS. He's not necessarily being made top 5 or anything crazy like that, but he is being buffed up to the point where he is 100% going to be worth using and worth investing in. His best insult partner in crime is likely to be Durin, who's going to be releasing alongside his rerun, and you're going to be able to have the chance to pull for Venti's new signature weapon, which is going to be a very big boost to his damage, and it's also the 3rd time Genshin has made Venti a signature weapon. I just can't stop pointing that out, it is very amusing to me. But in any case, if you don't have Venti, well then yeah, he's gained some new values of DPS and you can maybe consider him for that. Or, if you already have Venti, well then maybe consider picking up a signature weapon. And also lucky you if you happen to be going for Durin, because that is very likely to become a part of his best assault DPSing team. Another thing is that Venti is going to remain the AOE King. Obviously his grouping is quite situational, however I will say Genshin has been pushing chambers at times within the past year where Venti is indeed really comfortable to use. They're few and far in between, but they do crop up sometimes. But either way, he is able to group a decent amount of enemies, it just isn't practical super duper often. Though I will say that Venti is getting some quality of life where whenever you fire off his ult, it is going to go to the enemy itself instead of requiring you to run back, so that's also nice. Overall, in AoE situations where Venti is able to shine, he is going to feel absolutely excellent as always. This pro of his is obviously never changed, though it does require enemies to be groupable or at least pullable by his ult. And that just isn't always the case, but I would say what these buffs are doing is that they're providing him value outside of just his grouping, which was his main selling point before. And because you weren't always able to take advantage of his main selling point, that really did end up hurting his value. However, because that has been fixed, you end up getting a really great AoE DPS that ends up absolutely thriving in those situations while still just being a good DPS in general. It just works out for the better, and because the ult targets where the enemy location is now, you'll be able to enjoy his burst personal damage in most situations now. Lucky me who already has my Venti triple crowned and ready for this great day of reckoning. Another thing is that he's going to be a great Anemo DPS buffer. Essentially, they're adding buffing to Venti's kit. Whenever the on-field DPS is able to trigger swirls, Venti's able to increase their damage by quite a significant amount. So, for Anemo DPSs, he's going to end up being pretty good. On release, this isn't going to have many use cases because I believe it's going to be pretty difficult to fit him into a Xiao team because there's not really any other Hexenzirkel characters that fit into Xiao teams, and in Chaska teams, there's not really much Anemo damage going on there because she's more of a soup team DPS. However, we all already know that Varka is Anemo, and if he ends up being a DPS, then Venti is very likely to end up being his best in slot alongside Durin. I am pretty confident that Venti and Durin are going to form Varka's best assault team, so if that ends up being the case, then Venti ends up being a really good support investment if you're interested in Varka down the line, and all around, he ends up being usable before then too, because he's still able to be a main DPS himself. This does mean that his role as the best Anemo DPS may be taken over by Varka soon, but it ends up providing a very natural investment path. You can pull for Venti first, who is a very strong and self-sufficient DPS by himself, and then later down the line, upgrade into Varka, who is going to be a stronger Anemo DPS than him most likely, especially if you take a look at the recent strength of the Nordcry units in their complete best in slot teams. So not only is Venti gaining a lot of value in this new patch that we're getting, however, he is likely to gain even more value down the line when Varka releases because he's a Mondstadt character, and I do believe that these Hexenzirkel mechanics are being introduced in advance for the future Mondstadt characters that we're going to be getting. Then there's also the Hexenzirkel Buffs. Essentially, if you pair Venti with one other Hexerai character, then he's going to be able to access these buffs of his. Now, I think the character that you're most likely going to be pairing him with, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be Durin. However, you do have other cheap budget options. For instance, Fischl. So you do have other choices at your disposal if you don't plan to pull for Durin or if you just don't manage to get him. In fact, these Hexenzirkel buffs are basically what are giving him the majority of his newfound value. Before, he really did have a very specific niche, and I will always defend that people were too harsh on him. He did have his use cases. However, once again, it didn't really matter because he was still too niche to be worth the investment, and even if he did have a couple of use cases, it just wasn't enough to justify getting him. These Hexenzirkel buffs have absolutely saved this unit's value and turned him into a character that is genuinely worth getting. I won't say that these Hexenzirkel buffs have made him a must-pull. He's not necessarily like a new Archon release, but he is definitely on par with the standard that new units should currently be at. However, there are still some flaws to Venti. Yes, I know, impossible to imagine. Our peak femboy Anemo Archon does indeed have some issues to discuss. One of them being that his ER Ascension stat is not really that useful anymore. This is more of a smaller thing, but he doesn't ascend with attack percent or crit damage or crit rate or anything like that. So you're not really going to need the ER as much. I mean, hey, it's still nice to have, I guess, but it's definitely not going to be as useful as damaging stats, because now a lot of his value is going to be in his damage, because his personal damage has been upgraded by so freaking much. So yeah, ER Ascension stat is not going to be doing much for this guy. And then there's another thing, which is his overall DPS value. Like I mentioned earlier, he is the best Anemo DPS, but he is not going to be scratching best in slot team Skirk or best in slot team Moika. Like, no, not at all. To be fair, those are the two best DPSs in the game at the minute, but he's not really going to be like a top 5 DPS. This is why I say that he's skippable, because he is a good DPS. If you think Arlecchino's a good DPS, then Venti is too. Sure, Arlecchino is skippable because Moika exists, but Venti is going to be the best Anemo DPS on release, and he's only eventually going to become a great support for Varka down the line, most likely. However, if you already have plenty of strong DPSs, or even just a couple of really well-built strong teams, you're not really planning on investing into Varka down the line, and you don't really have much interest in Venti himself, then I would say that he's honestly quite skippable. He is definitely being made to be a strong unit, and he's going to have his own niche, and he is going to be very strong in AOE content. However, he is far from this absolute must-pull. I wouldn't put him on the levels of Shilunen, or Durin, or Moika, or anything like that in terms of pull value. He is very good, and he is being made to have his own niche, and he's really expanded his value, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every account is going to need him now. For some people, these buffs are the best thing since sliced bread. It's me, I'm some people, I think that. However, I can completely understand still skipping Venti simply because he doesn't really fit into your current account, or because you just don't really have the pulls to spare, or just for whatever reason. He's not a must. He is being made strong enough to the point where people who really like Venti, such as myself, can actually utilize him now and feel like he is a very substantial character on their account instead of having to cope with nicheness. So I would say that you don't really need Venti just based on raw damage alone. Keep in mind that there are still specific parts of his value that you might want to look into, and if your account just doesn't really need any of those and you're not getting Varka down the line, then you don't really need him. And another thing is that, of course, as always, his grouping is not going to be effective against bosses or anything like that. Now, the nice thing is that this flaw of his has obviously always been a thing, but it's so much less of an issue now because he's gotten these buffs. Like I said earlier, he has new value now. There are other things that Venti can do to the point where, while this is a flaw of his, it's not such a damning flaw to the point where the character just entirely becomes not worth getting anymore. I think Hoyoverse really masterfully weaved these buffs into his kit. So yes, his grouping may indeed fall off in certain scenarios, however, that does not completely kill his value. It might make other DPSs that are around his damage level more efficient to use, perhaps. However, he's not going to be completely unusable in those situations anymore. Really good job to Hoyoverse for these Venti buffs. I think they were implemented wonderfully, and I personally can't really criticize them in any particular way. They fixed his core issues and they gave him value for the future, I really can't complain about that. It is an excellent idea. And giving him a new signature that looks really, really nice. Obviously, I joke about it being his third signature at this point, but I do still really like the design of it, and I do still think it is a very cool looking weapon, and I think it's great that he's getting such a big boost to his performance overall. Really, really happy with this. This is fantastic, and I really hope that going into the future, we continue to see buffs handled like this, because I think that genuinely, this is a really nice way to implement buffs, and I am quite impressed with how it's been executed. I mean, dude, Venti is usable in 2025. What else do you even want me to say? I feel like that kind of speaks for itself. Crazy from Hoyoverse, man. Crazy from Hoyoverse, but I am very, very happy about it. Let's hope that they continue to buff characters in the future. Hopefully this video was able to tell you, my dear fanboy Venti's biggest pros and cons. This has been Juice, signing out, and please buff Child next, please.